Hi, I'm Julie Howe. I am a professor at Texas A&M University, and I also have an appointment with Texas A&M AgriLife Research. And today I want to talk to you about the influence of nutrient inputs such as fertilizer and manure on soil health. So first, let's make sure we understand what soil health is. Sometimes people also call this soil quality, but it's the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. Often it's really referred to as the ability of soil to function in its desired use, such as agriculture. And I guess I always try to think about it as soil health versus human health. When I feel good and I have good health, then that means my body's working great. I'm not diseased. I'm not, I can do everything as best as I can up to my potential. And so that's what soil health is, to get to the soil to its best potential. And to do soil health, there are four practices that people often talk about to maintain land that's minimized disturbance. So we want to try to reduce any type of mixing of the soil, such as tillage. Maximize biological diversity. So that usually for cropping systems, that's doing some sort of crop rotation. Um, and then maintain living plants as much as possible. So when we're doing an agricultural system, particularly with annual crops, that means maybe putting a cover crop in when we would normally not have a crop. And if for some reason we don't have time or no ability to put in a cover crop, then trying to keep as much residue on the surface of the soil as possible, so maximizing soil cover. And I always like to try to tell my students, if they can't remember, that you really don't want to go outside naked. You don't really want to see other people naked. Well, maybe there's a few people, some people, my students want to see, but in general, you don't want to see people running around naked all the time. And the soil being bare and uncovered to me is like seeing a naked soil. And I don't really want to see that because the raindrop impact, the wind impact, the environment is really harsh and is not going to make your soil better to have exposed soil. So, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about inputs into the farming system. In particular, I'm going to focus on fertilizer, manure. Pesticides are another one, and biostimulants. There's also things like uh, liming materials, but for this particular talk, I want to focus on fertilizer and manure. So when we talk about fertilizers, I'm going to define how I'm going to use the word fertilizer. Sometimes people talk about these as mineral fertilizers, chemical fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, mine fertilizers. What I really mean is something that's has a relatively high nutrient value. So here's some common nitrogen fertilizers. We're looking at 21 to 82% fertilizer. And they are all readily plant available. So you don't have to understand the chemical form or the transformation, but really none. And then this one reacts with water, and this one hydrolyzes, which is either an enzyme process that most microbes and all plants have the ability to do. So plants and microbes can do this. So this is a pretty easy process. And so that makes all of these forms of nitrogen readily available to plants, particularly when water's present. These usually have a very low carbon content. This one does, urea does have carbon, but it's not a lot of carbon. And then we also have a very consistent product because these are somehow manufactured. And so while they're only maybe 21% nitrogen, there's quite a bit of ammonium sulfate in the materials and it's relatively pure. Now, in contrast, we want to talk about manure. Manure has a very low nutrient value, and the nutrients are not readily available. They have to be, the microbes have to degrade them in order to make them available over time. So here's an example of beef manure, and as a solid, in this particular case, it was about 1% nitrogen. That's quite a bit lower than even the ammonium sulfate, which was 21%, and considerably lower than the 82% in the urea. So lots lower. Now, the other thing that we what makes up the rest of this recipe is carbon. These are organic compounds, so they're generated from degraded feed. The animal feed goes through the rumen and digestive system and comes out what couldn't really be degraded very well, and some of the byproducts of degradation. Those are all carbon compounds. And so while there is some nutrients in there, it's mostly carbon. It's also highly variable. It's not consistent like we saw with the fertilizers. So this is out of University of Minnesota Extension, and this is just some examples of looking at the range of nutrient contents of total nitrogen, ammonium nitrogen, total phosphorus, and total potassium in various different types of manure materials, looking at swine, poultry, beef, liquid, beef, solid, dairy, liquid, dairy, solid. And you see that we have little bouncing balls all over the place. If you look at, let's just look at total nitrogen, we got about 45 pounds per ton for swine liquid. We took a beef liquid, now we're at 40. We look at dairy liquid, now we're down to about 20. If we compare that with, looking at liquid, anyway, you can see there's quite a few differences across these. And the other thing you notice is, and maybe you're not as familiar with error bars, but this is an error bar. That means that this is the average, it's around 40, but it ranges from 0 to nearly 100. Well, that's a pretty big range. So that means you really don't know what it's going to be. You're maybe a little more confident about what the dairy solid is, but you're a lot less confident about what the beef liquid is. So the species of animal, as well as the type of manure, makes a difference. And then on top of that, there's variability within the gender and reproductive state. So male versus female, and lactating females versus non-lactating females make a difference. And some manures contain bedding material, particularly poultry litter. So here you see some poultry litter, and it could be sand, sawdust, pine straw, wood shavings. Depends somewhat regionally. Sometimes different regions even rotate seasonally. And so that's going to affect your quality of your manure. How you manage the manure. What's the moisture content? Do you store it in a lagoon and put it on liquid? Do you have a solid liquid separator? Do you store it and pile it? And how long do you store it? And how long do you pile it? Do you compost it? Are there additives from the farming operation, or do you add additives to the manure itself in this process? Sometimes aluminum sulfate is added to poultry houses to reduce ammonia volatilization. Sometimes there's additives in barns, like foot baths and things like that gets trapped into the manure. There's a lot of different sources of extra stuff that can be there. And then, okay, even if you had the same manure and you applied it to two pieces of land, you might have different application rates, different frequencies. And so there's a lot of things that go on that. So let's get back to soil health. So we're talking about nutrients and added and how their effect on soil health. Well, how do we assess soil health? We think about the chemical properties, the biological properties, and physical properties. Now, there are a lot of properties that we could assess for soil health. Just like you go to the doctor and there's a lot of things we can measure. But one thing that I particularly like, and I think is a good indicator of soil health overall, is carbon. It's kind of like taking your temperature. Carbon actually affects chemical, biological, and physical properties. And that's one reason we like carbon, because it is a strong driver of all of these properties. And usually it's a strong driver toward positive soil health value for these properties. And if you are concerned about what carbon does compared to soil organic matter, because you're like, well, I thought it was soil organic matter. Well, soil organic matter and carbon are essentially the same thing. It's just two ways to measure the same thing. 58% of soil organic matter is carbon. So when you add soil organic matter to the soil, or when you have soil organic matter in your soil, most of that is carbon. And so I'm going to talk about carbon because I personally think it's a more standardized way to analyze it. It's a standardized way to talk about it. But if you feel more comfortable with soil organic matter, use it. whatever you work, just realize that when you measure it, the two numbers are not the same thing. So soil organic carbon, how does fertilizer affect soil organic carbon? We'll start off with some of the basic ideas. So soil organic carbon, you can pretty much go out and find fertilizer studies and they have increased, decreased, or not affected soil organic carbon. Okay, well, so you're like, why did I come to this talk, right? But I'm going to try to dive into it a little bit deeper than that. So overall, the vast majority of the studies are going to say that fertilization increases soil organic carbon or soil organic matter, if you prefer that. This review article looked at 107 studies and 89 out of 107 observed fertilizer improving soil organic carbon. All right, I'm gonna continue on about that in a minute, but let's go on to manure. So manure is more difficult to assess. So on the surface, manure is made of organic matter, and therefore when you add manure, you're adding carbon. So it's a little bit of a, well, of course it's improving soil health, because we said soil organic carbon was a good driver of soil health. However, on its own, even without the carbon content, if you could not count that carbon that you added, it does increase plant growth compared to a no nutrient control because it does have some nutrient benefit. Because carbon itself is not going to improve plant growth because plants get carbon, but they don't get carbon from soil carbon, they get carbon from the atmosphere. And so if you increase plant growth, you typically see increased soil organic carbon. So manure is a little bit more not straightforward, and there are very few studies to really elucidate that. But I think at the end of the day, if your manure can improve your plant growth, then it can increase soil organic carbon above and beyond the carbon that was added. However, let's get back to that fertilizer situation I was mentioning. So we talk about fertilizers. There were some cases where we didn't see soil organic carbon increasing. And when you dive a little bit deeper into this, you see that soil organic carbon can decrease when fertilizer is applied if you're applying maybe excessive nitrogen above that recommended rate. There's a couple of studies that looked at that more specifically. And what they said was that, you see this yield response curve. It's very typical. You have nutrient supply and yield. And there's some point when you kind of reach a maximum yield. And at that point, then suddenly your yield is going to decrease. Well, it turns out that same inflection point actually ties into the soil health benefit. The soil health benefit of increasing soil organic carbon with fertilizer also kind of stops when you hit that maximum yield. And the mechanisms thought is that when you add nitrogen to support plant growth, you can't always separate that from supporting microbial growth. A lot of microbes are limited by nitrogen, just like plants are. They also compete for nitrogen. So what happens is you're hoping that if you're providing fertilizer and you're improving plant growth, then you are also increasing, there's that competition and the plants are taking some of it. Kind of keeps the microbes in check a little bit. But once the plant says, I don't need any more, I'm done, then you're really just fertilizing the microbes. And what do microbes do? They degrade organic matter. So the more nutrients they have, the more likely they can take that apart, tear apart that organic matter and release that carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. So additional N, and another way to think about this is lowering the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the residue. So this is another great graphic from University of Minnesota Extension. And if you've not thought about the carbon to nitrogen ratio, the carbon it's really a good indicator of what's going on. So when we say we have a large carbon to nitrogen ratio, that means we have more carbon compared to nitrogen. If you look at some residue material, we're thinking sawdust, wheat straw, corn stover. That's a lot of carbon, not a lot of nitrogen. And so microbes don't degrade this very well. They need more nitrogen in order to do that. So they steal it from the environment if it's there. And that's where we call nitrogen immobilization. So as long as there's nitrogen to be stolen, they take it. They may release it back later. I'm not saying they'll take it forever, but as long as there's material to degrade and nitrogen available, they'll take it from the environment. They'll degrade it. It's pretty slow unless there's considerable nitrogen added. So this is where if you're adding nitrogen, what you're doing is you're shifting this ratio this direction. Because when you have a lower ratio, that means there's more nitrogen available. You're more likely to get nitrogen out, and you're more likely to get faster decomposition rates. And this is why, you take a grass clipping or hay, a green hay, they degrade really fast compared to sawdust. I mean, you can have a pile of sawdust sit there for a long time. Now, when we think about manure and excess nitrogen, are we likely to actually provide enough manure to provide excess nitrogen? Well, we know that manure is fairly low in nitrogen. It varies, but it generally is fairly low. It's usually less than 5 or 10%, and usually closer to 1 to 2%. And so are you going to put enough manure to actually exceed your crop demand with manure alone? And so we really didn't see very many papers that even talked about excess nitrogen. And the other thing to sort of think about is if you did have bedding in your manure, that raises the carbon to nitrogen ratio to slow down that decomposition. So depending on what kind of manure you're adding, it could benefit. You got to be careful about that because nitrogen immobilization is a real thing, and you don't necessarily you don't want to time the adding of the bedding with the high carbon nitrogen ratio when you want plants to take up nitrogen, because the microbes could actually steal it from them, temporarily at least. All right, so another thing we looked at when we were evaluating the effects of nutrients on soil health is we thought, well, let's look at it on an ecosystem. So we found a couple of studies. One of them looked at agricultural ecosystems and compared it to grassland, and another one compared it to both grassland and forest systems. And so the first paper, they looked it up. There were less grassland systems where they looked at fertilizer inputs, but there were 37 grasslands and 133 ag systems. And they generally found that overall, soil organic carbon increased with nitrogen fertilization in agroecosystems, but decreased it in grasslands. And to support that, another paper found that they also saw a 3.6 increase in soil organic carbon in the ag ecosystems, but they saw decreased soil organic carbon in both forest and grassland systems. So if you think about it, native ecosystems are recycling nitrogen. And as long as you're not taking the nitrogen off, you get a nice balance. So you fertilize it, what are you doing? You're fertilizing and you're basically stimulating that degradation in excess of what it was before. You're shifting it off balance and causing that degradation. In an agroecosystem, we are harvesting already. So our recycling system is sort of messed up because we harvest the materials and take it away from the land. So we're mining it off. We do need to replenish it back. And so that is where we're seeing that benefit in nitrogen back to the plant and seeing the increased growth, which improves the carbon. All right, so overall, we know that manure and nutrients and stuff are going to affect degradation of soil organic matter. And so one question was to look at how does manure affect soil degradation, particularly over time. And we saw lots of conflicting results. I think the general consensus was that it decreased degradation. So that meant that manure was stable in the system. And so adding manure left that carbon residue over time, which is good and improves soil health. And you see evidence of this in some long-term cropping systems, particularly in Europe, where they manured for many, many years. However, it's not always the case. We saw, like I said, conflicting results, and we really think that some of that conflicting results is due to other management practices, because we don't work in a vacuum. We can't just isolate one thing, because to grow crops, there's so many different things that go into making that crop successful, or so many things that go in to make fertilizer successful. So this one study looked at composted dairy manure, and what they decided that this was their tillage basically negated all of their soil organic carbon benefits. They actually looked at soil organic matter, but here they had in 2003, they had an untreated check, they had inorganic fertilizer, and then they looked at various composted dairy manure, and they saw a nice increase that first year. But the next year, no differences. And they attributed this to conventional tillage and basically mixing all that soil up, that disturbance that we talked about, minimize disturbance. Their disturbance basically removed all the benefits that they did to put that in there. And they saw a rapid decline of soil organic matter over time. Another study by Watts felt that it depended on their cropping system. They looked at the addition of poultry manure compared to a control with no poultry manure, and they looked in soybean and corn systems, and they saw that, I'm going to say this backwards, the corn, they could tell no difference in tillage, and they did see that the manure made a difference. But in soybean, they only saw a difference when no tillage was soybean. They could not tell that they added the poultry manure and soil health benefits under conventional tillage, and that kind of supports this. Now, soybean is a legume and a nitrogen fixer, so there's a little bit more nitrogen in that system. We're adding poultry manure, which has nitrogen, plus the soybean is fixing its own nitrogen, and so maybe that conventional tillage was enough to get rid of that benefit where we did see the benefit under no tillage. And in corn, because we don't have the extra nitrogen in there, maybe it was less of the excess nitrogen. So I think this kind of gets back to that excess nitrogen problem, stimulating degradation, and then you get tillage on top of that, you stimulate degradation. So there is some other factors that get into it, and that's probably why we see so many different reports, because it's not about just manure, no manure, it's about the whole system and how it's being managed. I did want to mention about pH. So fertilizer has a very strong impact on pH, and pH has a strong impact on all those organisms. And so in general, for ammonium-based fertilizers are going to decrease soil pH. There are several papers that have found this. This is well known and many textbooks. I love this study. I went and got the data, and I have it in my introductory soil science class, because I think students often don't realize how much just general weathering. So here the soil was not quite pH 7, but almost pH 7. And after 9 years of no fertilization, the pH dropped to about 5. So almost a 2-unit pH drop in 9 years in this Illinois cropping system. Continual harvest, rainfall, all of these things contribute to acidification. Then in the plots where they added fertilizer, you'd think, well, you added fertilizer, you thought, well, maybe you got better biomass, maybe, but what you're seeing is all of these were significantly lower than the control. And I'm going to explain in a minute why ammonium is so acidifying. Urea is a little bit in between the nitrate fertilizers and the ammonium fertilizers, and that's only because that first step where urea has to break into ammonium does reduce acidity, and then the next steps create the acidity. So they kind of cancel each other out a little bit. So you saw no difference in these. And then the nitrate fertilizers actually reduce some of the acidification process. So why does ammonium decrease soil pH? Well, when plants take up ammonium, they literally exchange ammonium for protons, and protons are acids. So that means every time they pull in to the plant ammonium, they're pushing out an acid. And that's one of the problems. Then if the plant decides if the plant doesn't take up the ammonium, and let's just say it sits there, it can convert to nitrate in a process called nitrification. This is a microbial process, and this process also generates acid. So if you apply ammonium, there are 2 processes, whether the plant takes it up or not, that are likely to occur that causes the acidity. Now, the The decrease in pH is very dependent on your soil. Each soil is going to have a different buffering capacity, and some soils are very well buffered, and those soils that are above pH are typically better buffered against this process, and soils that are less than 7, this is kind of a generalization, but because it's not 100% true, but generally if you're less than 7, you'll see this effect over time a little bit more obvious. But don't be fooled. I've seen this effect occur in long-term ag soils that started out at pH 7.5 or 8. I've seen them down to pH 6. So it happens. I've even seen them down closer to 5 too. Now, when we think about manure, how does manure affect pH? This is a much more difficult question, again, because manure is more variable, but also because organic residues like manure are also really good buffers. And so it depends on what that pH of the manure is to begin with in order to see how this works. And so it also depends on how much manure you're adding and your rate and frequency, et cetera. And it depends again on your soil buffering capacity. So you see there's a lot of factors that go into how manure is going to affect pH. But in general, a lot of manures have a pH greater than 7. If they're composted, then they're a little bit lower, and that may have less of effect on that pH increase. pH is going to be affected by diet and organism and all these other things that we've talked about. But most commonly, what you're going to see, at least in the short term, is a pH increase. And if you let it degrade over a longer time, you might see that decrease back, go back down. So you might see a peak and then come back down. But overall, at least in the short term, you often see a pH increase. Well, what does this mean? Well, I'm going to skip that for just a second, and I'm going to go, what does that mean for soil health? I'm going to talk about that in terms of microbes in a minute. But some of the other things that soil organic carbon does is it improves your cation exchange capacity. That means how much the organic matter itself is going to hold cation nutrients, and that is usually a benefit to most soils. It reduces your leaching and nutrient loss due to rainfall. And then this host of properties that are related to physical properties like bulk density, porosity, water holding capacity, infiltration, hydraulic conductivity, aggregate formation, aggregate size. These would be aggregates. So here's some very large aggregates. This is a no-till, this is a conventional tilled soil. This is a no-till soil, and you can see a lot smaller particles and aggregates. So the aggregate size is well, actually, this is actually, I'm not saying the right thing here. Usually aggregates have a much, and under a no-till system, are going to have a greater variability in aggregate size. You're going to have large aggregates and small aggregates. This is probably not relevant, but if you look at some of these, you have a lot of powdery soil, you have all kinds of stuff here. But this right here is a nice looking granular soil on the soil surface. Anyway, the idea is that soil organic carbon generally improves all of these properties. And usually when we reduce tillage, when we, if we can add fertilizers to benefit plant growth, we generally see increased soil organic carbon due to that nutrient boost. So I want to get back to microbes for a second. I don't know why I have those slides in that order, but that's what I did. So we are very interested also in that microbial or that organismal diversity. Now we know we could do crop rotation, but it's also good to look at the microbes because those are the ones that are actually degrading the carbon or the organic matter. And so here we want to look at microbial biomass, which indicates the microbial population size. And in general, if you have more carbon, you're going to have more population. And if your fertilizer and manure increases carbon, then you're going to have increased microbial pools. So that's pretty, again, carbon is our go-to answer. But there's a caveat on that. If you have fertilizer, that only works unless the pH goes too low. And so microbes correlate. Remember I said that's why I had that whole section on pH, because when the pH goes less than 5, usually that's when microbes decide they don't particularly want to play the game that we were talking about earlier. Here's a meta-analysis of 107 long-term studies, and they found that if you just went across all the studies, there was about a 15.1% increase in microbial biomass for all of these. But if you looked by pH, less than 5, no effect. They saw both increases and decreases and no effect. But greater than 7, there was a 48% increase. So while if you looked them across the board, it was only 15% increase. If you just looked at those that were greater than 7, it was 48% increase. This is quite a big difference. And this is why I went over that part about how ammonium fertilizers can really affect your pH. So understanding that when you get below pH 5, all of that soil health benefit that you were thinking about is probably not going to translate the same way. And then the other ways to look at microbes is to look at the microbial community composition and function. So this is, instead of how many people are there, it's who those people are and what do they do. Getting a little more personal. This is really inconclusive. We do not have good roadmaps. Some of the things that we found were, in general, that the microbial community will change with pH. We just said that pH was a big driver, and pH is dependent upon nitrogen. So nitrogen can affect pH, which affects microbial community composition. In general, if you're usually favoring bacteria. However, when the pH is lowered, you do not necessarily see this. So again, when pH is getting low, all things change. Manure really improves fungal and bacterial diversity, which shouldn't be a surprise since manure provides food for these organisms. And there was a nice correlation between bacteria diversity and the soil organic carbon gradient. So as long as there's more carbon, there's more bacterial diversity. And then there was another paper that talked about processing of manures, and the more you process, well, the less you process them, the more you're going to see nitrifying and denitrifying organisms. Nitrifying organisms, whether you kind of could be bad or good, because forming nitrate from ammonium is maybe not the end of the world, although it does contribute potentially to nitrogen loss through leaching. But if you go from nitrate to denitrify them and turn them into nitrogen gases, this is a loss of fertilizer and potentially causing greenhouse gases. So this is definitely more problematic. And then there's some other indicators, extracellular enzyme activity, respiration, colonization rates. There's a bunch of other things out there. Overall, if you're going to increase soil organic carbon, you're going to increase microbial activity. I think I'm just going to leave it at that. So let's get back to how do fertilizer and manure inputs affect soil health. And, we take this in consideration that we have minimizing disturbance, maximizing biological diversity, maintaining living plants, and maximizing soil cover. But now we take this extra step of looking at fertilizer or nutrient inputs, which don't really fit in any of those 4 categories. But overall, we found that if you can use that nutrient to increase yield, biomass of your plants, then you're probably going to increase soil organic carbon and all of those associated health benefits. So that's we could put another little column here. However, you do not want to do excess fertilizer, and excess nutrients can reduce soil organic carbon and negate some of those benefits. And the mechanism and degree of effect is really variable, and particularly variable with manure because it's variable to begin with. But in general, because carbon is being added with manure, it is easy to improve soil health with manure. What you want to do is figure out how to prevent it from disappearing. And so that's where you would probably get back into these, particularly that minimizing disturbance and thinking about your biological diversity. So I want to thank you for your attention. I hope this provided some insights on how fertilizers can contribute to soil health. This research was a project that this group of fine young, most of them very, well, they're all young, scientists. These 4 are graduate students that helped work on this project. And 2 of them are professors. One's running a lab, and the other one is finishing up his PhD this year. And so we're very excited that the success of all of these students and moving on to bigger and better things. But they largely spent a lot of time working on this this research project to look at this benefits of nutrients on soil health. We also looked at a couple other things as well, but this is what they've done. So I really appreciate your attention. If you have any questions, I'm happy to talk to you about them.